The summer of 1886 had been merciless to Tombstone, Arizona. The desert sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, and the air hung thick with dust and the smell of fear. In a town where silver had once flowed like water, now only suspicion and whispers filled the streets. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." Jack Ryder Callahan guided his black stallion Thunder down Allen Street, his weathered face hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim. At 42, he'd earned his reputation as the loneliest man in Arizona territory, a reputation he'd cultivated carefully over the past 7 years. Better to be feared and left alone than to risk caring about someone again. "There goes the ghost," whispered Mrs. Eleanor Whitman to her companion as they hurried past with their market baskets. "They say he's got the blood of 20 men on his hands." Ryder's steel-gray eyes flicked toward the women, but he said nothing. Let them believe what they wanted. It kept them at a safe distance. As he approached the Oriental Saloon, a commotion near the town well caught his attention. A crowd had gathered in a rough circle, their voices rising in anger and disgust. Sheriff Tom McClory stood at the center, his hand resting on his gun belt as he addressed the mob. "I don't care if he's just a boy," McClory was saying. "Look at those marks on his arms. Could be plague, could be devil's work. Either way, he's not staying in my town." Dr. Marcus Holliday, the town's physician and a distant cousin of the famous Doc Holliday, stood protectively over a small figure huddled against the stone well. "Tom, he's just a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Those aren't disease marks, they're deliberate scars. Someone did this to him." Ryder dismounted and pushed through the crowd, his presence causing the townspeople to step back instinctively. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water. A thin boy with matted auburn hair sat pressed against the well, his knees drawn up to his chest. His clothes were little more than rags, and his face was streaked with dirt and tears. But it was the scars on his exposed forearms that stopped Ryder's heart. 3 parallel lines on each arm, precise and methodical, forming a pattern that Ryder recognized with sickening clarity. The boy's green eyes met Ryder's, and something passed between them. A recognition that went deeper than sight or sound. The child had seen those same scars before. "Problem here, Sheriff?" Ryder's voice carried the quiet authority that made most men think twice about crossing him. McClory straightened, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Nothing that concerns you, Callahan. Just dealing with a diseased vagrant." "He's not diseased." Ryder knelt slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. "Can you tell me your name, son?" The boy opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He pointed to his throat and shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with terror. "He's mute," Dr. Holliday said quietly. "Has been since he wandered into town 3 days ago. Won't eat, won't sleep indoors, just sits here by the well, watching everyone with those haunted eyes." "See?" called out Ezra Clanton, the town banker. "Probably saw something he shouldn't have. Could bring all kinds of trouble down on decent folk." Ryder's jaw tightened. "The only trouble I see is a town full of cowards turning their backs on a helpless child." "Now see here, Callahan," began Reverend Samuel King. "We have families to protect. That boy could be carrying disease, or worse, he could be cursed. Those marks on his arms—" "Those marks," Ryder interrupted, rolling up his own sleeves to reveal identical scars on his forearms, "are the brand of the Crimson Creek Gang. They mark their victims so they can never forget who owns them." The crowd fell silent, staring at Ryder's scars in shock. Even Sheriff McClory took a step back. "How do you know that?" Dr. Holliday asked quietly. Ryder's eyes never left the boy's face. "Because I escaped from them 7 years ago. This child didn't." The boy's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. He scrambled to his feet and threw himself at Ryder, clinging to the cowboy's legs with desperate strength. Silent sobs shook his small frame as he pressed his face against Ryder's worn leather chaps. "Easy, son. Ryder murmured, his voice gentler than anyone in Tombstone had ever heard it. "You're safe now. I won't let them hurt you anymore." Sheriff McLaury frowned. "Now hold on, Callahan. You can't just—" "I can and I will." Ryder's voice turned to steel as he looked up at the sheriff. "This boy is under my protection now." "Your protection?" McLaury laughed harshly. "Since when do you care about anyone but yourself?" The question hit deeper than intended. Ryder's jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered. "Since I looked into the eyes of a child who's been through the same hell I survived." Dr. Holliday stepped forward. "Jack, are you certain about this? Caring for a traumatized child requires patience, understanding." "He'll get both." Ryder gently pried the boy's arms from around his legs and knelt to face him at eye level. "What do you say, partner? Want to come home with me?" The boy stared into Ryder's eyes for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly and took Ryder's offered hand. As they walked toward Ryder's horse, the crowd began to disperse, their whispered conversations following them like shadows. "Mark my words," Sheriff McLaury called after them. "That boy's trouble, and trouble has a way of spreading to everyone around it." Ryder didn't turn around, but his grip on the boy's hand tightened protectively. The sheriff was right about one thing. Trouble was coming. But it wasn't coming with the boy. It had been hunting them both for years, and now it had finally found them. That evening, in the small cabin Ryder had built on the outskirts of town, he watched the boy eat his first real meal in days. The child was methodical about it, as if he'd learned that food was never guaranteed and should never be wasted. "I'm going to call you Danny," Ryder said quietly. "That was my brother's name. He would have been about your age now if—" He trailed off, old pain flickering across his features. The boy, Danny, looked up from his plate and pointed to himself, then made a series of gestures. He pointed to his scars, then to Ryder's, then made a cutting motion across his throat. "You're trying to tell me something about how you lost your voice," Ryder interpreted. "It has to do with these scars, doesn't it?" Danny nodded vigorously, then pointed out the window toward the desert and made a slashing gesture across his throat. "They cut your throat to keep you quiet about something you saw." Ryder's voice was deadly calm. "What did you see, son? What do they want to keep secret?" Danny's eyes filled with tears, and he shook his head frantically, pressing his hands over his ears as if trying to block out terrible memories. "It's okay," Ryder said quickly. "You don't have to remember right now, but someday when you're ready, you're going to help me make sure they can never hurt another child the way they hurt us." Outside, thunder whinnied nervously in the corral. Ryder moved to the window and peered into the darkness. 3 riders sat motionless on the ridge overlooking his cabin, their silhouettes black against the star-filled sky. "They found us," he whispered. Dawn came gray and threatening over Tombstone, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the violence to come. Ryder had spent the night keeping watch, his Winchester rifle across his knees, while Danny slept fitfully on a makeshift bed by the fireplace. The boy had awakened twice, his mouth open in silent screams, his small fists beating against invisible attackers. The 3 riders had disappeared before sunrise, but Ryder knew they hadn't gone far. The Crimson Creek gang was like a pack of wolves, patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless when it came to protecting their secrets. Danny sat at the rough wooden table, picking at his breakfast with the careful movements of a child who'd learned that sudden gestures could bring pain. His green eyes kept darting to the windows, as if expecting monsters to come crashing through at any moment. "We need to talk, son," Ryder said gently, settling into the chair across from him. "I know you can't speak, but maybe you can show me things." Danny's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes fixed on Ryder's face with an intensity that was unsettling in one so young. Ryder rolled up his sleeves, revealing the 3 parallel scars on each forearm. "You remember getting these, don't you?" Danny immediately pushed up his own sleeves, comparing the marks. They were identical, 3 precise lines burned deep into the flesh, the mark of ownership that the Crimson Creek gang branded onto every child they took. "How long were you with them?" Ryder asked. Danny held up 4 fingers, then pointed to himself and made a smaller gesture, indicating he'd been even younger when it started. 4 years. Jesus Christ. Ryder's hands clenched into fists. You were just a baby when they took you. Danny nodded, then reached into his shirt and pulled out a small object wrapped in dirty cloth. With trembling hands, he unwrapped it to reveal a silver locket, tarnished with age and wear. Ryder's breath caught in his throat. May I? Danny handed him the locket with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and auburn hair, holding a baby. On the opposite side was an inscription, "For my beloved Daniel. Love always, Mama." Daniel, Ryder whispered. Your real name is Daniel. He looked up at the boy. And this is your mother? Danny nodded, tears beginning to stream down his cheeks. He pointed to the photograph, then to himself, then made a gesture of searching, looking around desperately. You want to find her? Ryder's voice was thick with emotion. We will, son. I promise you that. A soft knock at the door made both of them freeze. Danny immediately scrambled under the table, his whole body shaking with terror. Jack, it's Doc Holliday. I brought some medical supplies for the boy. Ryder relaxed slightly and opened the door. Dr. Holliday entered, carrying his black medical bag, but his usually calm demeanor was troubled. How's he doing? The doctor asked, nodding toward the table where Danny was hiding. Better. But Doc, we've got a problem. 3 men were watching the cabin last night. They're from the gang that took him. Dr. Holliday's face grew grave. I was afraid of that. There are strangers in town asking questions. Hard-looking men with guns and no patience for polite conversation. They're claiming the boy is their nephew, run away from their ranch. What did you tell them? Nothing. But others weren't so careful. They know he's here, Jack, and they know you're protecting him. Ryder knelt beside the table and coaxed Danny out from underneath. It's okay, son. Dr. Holliday is a friend. Danny emerged slowly, his eyes darting between the 2 men. Dr. Holliday knelt down to the boy's level, his voice gentle and reassuring. Hello, Daniel. I'm Dr. Holliday. I want to help you and Mr. Callahan stay safe. Danny's eyes widened at the use of his real name. He looked at Ryder questioningly. I told him about the locket, Ryder explained, and about what those animals did to you. Doctor. Holliday examined the scars on Danny's arms with professional detachment, but Ryder could see the anger building in the physician's eyes. These were done with a heated blade, he said quietly, deliberately and methodically. Whoever did this wanted to cause maximum pain while ensuring the child survived. They use pain to break their spirits, Ryder said, his voice hard as granite. Make them too afraid to run, too broken to fight back. Danny suddenly grabbed Ryder's arm and pointed urgently toward the window. 3 riders were approaching the cabin at a steady pace, their faces hidden beneath hat brims, but their intentions clear. Take Danny and go out the back, Ryder ordered Dr. Holliday. There's a root cellar behind the woodshed. Hide there until this is over. What are you going to do? What I should have done 7 years ago. Ryder moved to a chest in the corner and pulled out a gun belt he hadn't worn since coming to Tombstone. The leather was well oiled, the twin Colts perfectly maintained. I'm going to end this. Jack, there are 3 of them. I know. Ryder strapped on the gun belt, the weight of it familiar and comforting. But I've got something they don't expect. What's that? I know all their secrets. Every hideout, every weakness, every dirty trick they use. Ryder's smile was cold as winter steel. I was one of them once before I found the courage to escape. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Dr. Holliday stared at him in shock. You were part of the gang? For 3 years. After they took me, I did things... Ryder's voice broke slightly. Things I've spent every day since trying to atone for. But I learned their ways, their methods. And now I'm going to use that knowledge to protect this boy. The riders were close enough now that Ryder could make out their faces. Silas Blackwood rode in the center, his scarred face twisted into the same cruel smile Ryder remembered from his nightmares. To his left was Marcus Snake Donovan, thin and deadly as his nickname suggested. On the right rode Billy Crenshaw, younger than the others, but with a reputation for brutality that made even hardened outlaws nervous. "They're here," Ryder said quietly. "Doc, get Danny to safety. Now." As Dr. Holliday led Danny toward the back door, the boy suddenly broke free and ran to Ryder. He wrapped his small arms around the cowboy's waist and looked up at him with fierce determination. Danny opened his mouth and, for the first time since Ryder had known him, forced out a single raspy word: "Careful." The sound was barely more than a whisper, damaged by whatever they'd done to his throat, but it was the most beautiful thing Ryder had ever heard. "I will be, son," Ryder promised, kneeling to embrace the boy. "And when this is over, we're going to find your mama. That's a promise." Outside, Silas Blackwood's voice boomed across the desert air. "Jack Callahan, we know you're in there, boy, and we know you've got something that belongs to us. Come out and let's settle this like civilized men." Ryder checked his guns one last time and stepped toward the door. 7 years of running were about to end, one way or another. The three riders sat motionless on their horses 50 yards from Ryder's cabin, their silhouettes dark against the storm-laden sky. Silas Blackwood, now in his 50s but still powerfully built, sat in the center, his scarred face bearing the same cruel intelligence that had haunted Ryder's nightmares for 7 years. The scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, a souvenir from Ryder's escape, seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Ryder stepped onto his porch, his hands hanging loose at his sides, ready to draw. The frightened boy who'd once cowered before these men was gone, replaced by a man who'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop evil was to face it head on. "Well, well," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Little Jackie Callahan, all grown up and playing hero. Heard you've been taking in strays." "Silas." Ryder's voice was steady, betraying none of the rage burning in his chest. "You're looking old. Hard living catching up with you?" Blackwood's laugh was like gravel in a tin can. 7 years of hunting you has been worth every gray hair, boy. You cost me something precious when you ran. My reputation for keeping my property in line. Danny isn't property. He's a child." "Danny?" Snake Donovan spat into the dust. "His name's Daniel Morrison, and he belongs to us. Been our good luck charm for 4 years now." Ryder's blood turned to ice. "Morrison? As in Sheriff Tom McClory's nephew?" Billy Crenshaw grinned, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "Took you long enough to figure it out. Little Danny here witnessed something he shouldn't have. Something that could hang his dear uncle if it ever came to light. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Sheriff McClory's eagerness to get rid of Danny, his insistence that the boy was trouble. He'd been protecting himself, not the town. "What did Danny see?" Ryder demanded. "Tell him, Billy," Blackwood said, his eyes never leaving Ryder's face. "Tell him about the night we visited the Morrison Ranch." Billy's grin widened. 4 years ago, we needed supplies and information. Sheriff McClory was happy to provide both, for a price. But his brother-in-law, Danny's daddy, wasn't so cooperative. Started talking about duty and honor and other foolishness. So we shut him up, Snake added casually. Permanently, along with his pretty wife. Would have done the same to the boy, but Silas had other ideas. "A witness is useful," Blackwood explained, his voice conversational. "Especially one too young and scared to talk. We kept little Danny as insurance against his uncle's continued cooperation. And it worked beautifully, until the boy got brave and ran away 3 days ago." Ryder felt sick. Danny had watched these monsters murder his parents, then been forced to live with them for 4 years. No wonder the child couldn't speak. The trauma had stolen his voice along with his innocence. "You're going to pay for what you did to that family," Ryder said, his hand moving closer to his gun. "Are we?" Blackwood's horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's tension. "You're one man, Jackie. We're 3. And we remember how you used to shake like a leaf when I so much as looked at you cross. That was a long time ago. Not so long that we've forgotten your weaknesses," Snake said. "Still got a soft spot for helpless children, don't you? Just like your little brother." The mention of his brother hit Ryder like a physical blow. "Leave Tommy out of this. Hard to do, considering he's the reason you're here." Blackwood's smile turned vicious. Did you really think we didn't know? Tommy Callahan, age 8, taken by the Crimson Creek gang 7 years ago, died trying to escape, just like you should have. Tommy died because I was too much of a coward to save him, Ryder said, his voice thick with old guilt. I won't make that mistake again. Noble words, but you're forgetting something important. Blackwood's hand moved to his gun. We don't need the boy alive anymore. Sheriff McClory's usefulness has run its course. A dead witness tells no tales. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Behind the cabin, hidden in the root cellar, Dr. Holliday held Danny close as the boy trembled with silent terror. The child's damaged voice had managed one more word. Uncle, confirming what they'd all just learned. In fact, Blackwood continued, killing both of you would solve all our problems. No witnesses, no interference, and a clear message to anyone else who might think about crossing the Crimson Creek gang. The storm clouds chose that moment to open up, sending the first fat raindrops spattering into the dust. The sudden change in weather seemed to break the tension like a snapping rope. Take him, Blackwood ordered. But Ryder was already moving. Years of practice and the desperate need to protect Danny had honed his reflexes to a razor's edge. His right-hand Colt cleared leather in a blur of motion, the shot echoing across the desert like thunder. Billy Crenshaw toppled from his saddle, clutching his chest and screaming in pain. Snake's return shot went wide as his horse reared in panic, and Ryder's second bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. Blackwood's gun was out now, the barrel swinging toward Ryder with deadly intent. But before he could fire, a small figure burst from behind the cabin. Danny had broken free from Dr. Holliday and was running toward the gunfight, his mouth open in a silent scream of terror and determination. In his small hand, he clutched a rusty knife he'd found in the root cellar. No! Ryder shouted, but it was too late. Blackwood's gun roared, and Ryder felt the bullet tear through his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing against the cabin wall. As darkness closed in around the edges of his vision, he saw Blackwood dismounting, his gun trained on the approaching boy. Should have stayed hidden, you little rat, Blackwood snarled. Now you'll die with your protector. But Danny wasn't running blindly. The 4 years of captivity had taught him things about survival that no child should know. As Blackwood took aim, Danny suddenly veered to the side and dove behind the water trough, the bullet meant for his heart splintering the wood inches from his head. Clever little bastard, Blackwood muttered, advancing on the trough. But you can't hide forever. Ryder forced himself upright, pain blazing through his wounded shoulder. His left arm hung useless at his side, but his right hand still worked. His second Colt was still in its holster, and muscle memory took over where conscious thought failed. The shot came from an impossible angle, fired one-handed while Ryder was still falling. It should have gone wide, should have been nothing more than a desperate gesture. Instead, it found its mark with the precision born of absolute necessity. Blackwood screamed as the bullet shattered his gun hand, sending his weapon spinning away into the mud. He stumbled backward, clutching his mangled fingers, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. Impossible, he gasped. You were always weak, always afraid. I was, Ryder admitted, struggling to stay conscious. But that boy in there isn't weak, and he's not afraid anymore. Are you, Danny? From behind the water trough came a sound that made everyone freeze. The sound of a child's voice, damaged but determined, speaking words that would change everything. My name, Danny said, his voice growing stronger with each syllable, is Daniel Morrison, and I remember everything. The rain was falling harder now, turning the dust to mud and washing the blood from the wounded men lying in the dirt. Sheriff Tom McClory arrived with 3 deputies just as Danny emerged from behind the water trough, the rusty knife still clutched in his small hand. What in the hell? McClory began, then stopped short when he saw his nephew standing in the open, no longer the mute, terrified child who'd appeared in town 3 days ago. Hello, Uncle Tom, Danny said, his damaged voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. I've been waiting 4 years to talk to you. McClory's face went white as fresh snow. Danny? But you can't. You don't. I can't speak? Danny's green eyes were hard as emeralds. I could always speak, Uncle Tom. I just chose not to. Not to them. He pointed at the fallen gang members. And not to you. Dr. Holliday emerged from behind the cabin, his medical bag in hand, and immediately went to tend to Ryder's wounded shoulder. The cowboy was conscious but losing blood fast. Easy, Jack, the doctor murmured. You've lost a lot of blood, but you'll live. The boy, Ryder gasped. Is he safe? I'm safe, Danny answered for himself, walking over to kneel beside Ryder. Thanks to you. Blackwood was on his knees in the mud, cradling his shattered hand and staring at the boy with a mixture of fear and fury. You little rat, he snarled. After everything we did for you. Everything you did to me, Danny corrected, his young voice carrying an authority that silenced the outlaw. You murdered my parents. You branded me like cattle. You kept me prisoner for 4 years. And you made my uncle help you do it. Sheriff McClory took a step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Now see here, boy. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Danny's voice grew stronger, as if 4 years of stored words were finally finding their way out. I was hiding in the root cellar the night you came to our ranch. I saw everything. The deputies looked confused, glancing between their sheriff and the boy. Deputy Frank Warren, the senior man among them, stepped forward. What's the boy talking about, Tom? Danny answered before McClory could speak. 4 years ago, these men came to our ranch looking for supplies and information about Army patrols. My Uncle Tom was already working with them, helping them avoid the law in exchange for money. That's a lie, McClory protested, but his voice lacked conviction. My father found out about the arrangement, Danny continued, his eyes never leaving his uncle's face. He threatened to expose Uncle Tom to the territorial authorities, so Uncle Tom told these men where to find us. Blackwood laughed bitterly from his position in the mud. Smart boy. Too smart for his own good. They came at night, Danny said, his voice beginning to shake with remembered terror. I was in the root cellar getting potatoes for supper when I heard the shooting. I saw them kill my father first, then my mother when she tried to run, and I saw Uncle Tom standing there, watching it happen. Deputy Warren's face had gone pale. Tom, tell me this isn't true. McClory's composure finally cracked. You don't understand. They would have killed me too if I hadn't cooperated. I had no choice. You had a choice when they took Danny, Dr. Holliday said quietly. You could have reported them then. Instead, you let them keep him as insurance for your continued cooperation. The boy was supposed to die with his parents, McClory said desperately. I never wanted him to suffer. But when Blackwood decided to keep him alive, you saw an opportunity. Ryder finished, his voice weak but clear. A traumatized, mute witness who could never testify against you, so you let them keep him, and you've been helping them ever since. Danny nodded. Every time they needed information about Army movements, or when posses were being formed, Uncle Tom would pass word through coded messages left at the old mine. In exchange, they kept me alive and kept quiet about his involvement. Until 3 days ago, Deputy Warren said, understanding dawning in his eyes. When you finally found the courage to escape. I didn't escape, Danny corrected. They brought me here. Blackwood was getting tired of keeping me alive, and Uncle Tom was getting nervous about having a witness, even a silent one. They planned to kill me and make it look like an accident. Blackwood spat blood into the mud. Should have done it years ago. Keeping you alive was my biggest mistake. No, Danny said firmly. Your biggest mistake was underestimating me. I may have been silent, but I wasn't blind or deaf. I learned things during those 4 years. Names, places, plans. I know where you've been hiding. I know about the stolen Army payroll buried in the Dragoon Mountains. I know about the other children you've taken over the years. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Even Ryder, despite his pain, looked up sharply. Other children? Dr. Holliday asked. Danny nodded grimly. 7 of them over the past 10 years. Some they sold to mining camps as slave labor. Others, he trailed off, unable to finish. Others they killed when they were no longer useful. Blackwood finished with cruel satisfaction. Just like we should have done with you. Deputy Warren had heard enough. Tom McClory, You're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and accessory to kidnapping." He turned to his fellow deputies. "Arrest Blackwood and his men too, and send word to the territorial marshal. We're going to need federal help with this." As the deputies moved to secure the prisoners, Danny stayed close to Ryder's side while Dr. Holliday worked on the cowboy's wound. "Will he be okay?" Danny asked, his voice small and frightened again. "He'll be fine," Dr. Holliday assured him. "The bullet went clean through. He'll have a scar to match the others, but he'll heal." Danny looked down at his own scarred arms, then at Ryder's. "Mr. Callahan?" "Yeah, son? You said these scars don't define us. What we do after we get them is what matters." "That's right." Danny's voice grew stronger again. "Then I want to help you find the other children, the ones who are still alive, and I want to make sure no one else ever has to go through what we did." Ryder smiled despite his pain. "That's a big job for someone so young." "I'm not young anymore," Danny said, with a maturity that broke Ryder's heart. "But I'm not alone either. I have you now." 3 weeks later, federal marshals raided the gang's hideout in the Dragoon Mountains, recovering the stolen army payroll and rescuing 2 children who'd been held captive for over a year. The information Danny provided led to the arrest of 7 more gang members and the recovery of evidence linking them to dozens of crimes across the territory. Sheriff Tom McClory was sentenced to life in prison. Silas Blackwood and his surviving men were hanged for murder. And in a small cabin outside Tombstone, a scarred cowboy and a brave young boy began the long process of healing. Together, Danny never did find his mother. She had died in the same attack that killed his father, but he found something else. A family with a man who understood his scars and loved him despite them. The scars would always be there on both their arms, but they no longer defined them. They were simply reminders of how far they'd come and how much they'd overcome. Together. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.